The day my wife sued me for everything I owned, I was still struggling to button my shirt. That detail matters more than it should. Not because of the shirt, but because of what it represented. I had spent decades making decisions that altered lives, fortunes, futures. I had ruled on cases people would remember for years. Yet on that morning, my fingers wouldn't obey me. They hovered, numb and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. I remember thinking with a bitter kind of irony that this was how my authority finally ended. Not with scandal or disgrace, but with silence inside my own body. I was a judge, influential, respected. People used to stand when I entered a room. They still did, technically. But respect is a fragile thing. It survives only as long as usefulness does. The illness crept in slowly like something patient and intelligent. First the tingling, then the numbness, then the weakness that no amount of willpower could override. Doctors spoke in cautious sentences, but their eyes told the truth. This was not a chapter. This was a rewrite. I would never live normally again, not in the way I understood normal. My wife knew before I accepted it. We had 3 children. That fact anchored every decision I made, even as my world began to shrink. I stayed composed for them. I smiled. I listened. I told myself that stability mattered more than honesty about fear. At night, when the house was quiet, I lay awake rehearsing movements in my mind. How to stand without stumbling, how to grip without dropping, how to appear whole. She watched all of this from a careful distance. At first, she was attentive, almost tender, but tenderness born of obligation has a short lifespan. Gradually, her patience thinned. She sighed more, looked away more, touched me less. I told myself this was normal. Caregiver fatigue. Stress. Anyone would struggle, I reasoned. I defended her even in my own thoughts. What I didn't see was how quickly compassion can curdle into resentment when weakness enters a marriage uninvited. The lawyer came into our lives quietly. He was recommended to me for legitimate reasons. Asset management, long-term planning, contingencies I was suddenly forced to consider. He was sharp, confident, precise. Everything I once was, condensed into a younger body. I introduced them without hesitation. Why would I hesitate? Trust was still my default setting back then. I noticed much later how she laughed differently around him. There are moments in life that only make sense in retrospect. A glance held half a second too long. A conversation that continues after you've left the room. A feeling you dismiss because acknowledging it would require courage you don't yet have. By the time I realized my marriage was no longer a safe place, it was already a battlefield I couldn't physically fight on. I lost my wife first, then my health. Then, with surgical precision, everything I had built. And the most devastating part? The law, the very system I had served my entire life, was the weapon she used to finish me. This is how it began. There is a particular kind of terror that comes from realizing you are being studied while you are distracted by survival. While I was learning how to walk without trusting my legs, my wife was learning how to live without trusting me. I noticed it in fragments. She stopped telling me about her day. Not abruptly, just selectively. Details disappeared. Names were omitted. When I asked questions, she answered with practiced neutrality, the same tone witnesses use when they don't want to incriminate themselves. I knew that tone. I had heard it thousands of times. I just never expected it in my own kitchen. The lawyer became a constant presence. Emails copied to her instead of me. Meetings scheduled when I was at physical therapy. Documents explained to her for clarity. I told myself this was efficiency, delegation, adaptation to my condition. I had spent a lifetime teaching myself not to be threatened by competence in others. What I hadn't learned was how to recognize intimacy disguised as professionalism. She started dressing differently on days she met him. Not provocatively, intentionally. As if she were preparing for an audience instead of an appointment. When I commented once casually, she said she was just trying to feel normal. That word again. Normal. It had become a weapon I didn't yet know how to disarm. At home, I became something like a fixture, present but unmoving. Conversations flowed around me instead of through me. Decisions were made without consultation, then presented as conclusions. When I objected, she accused me of being controlling. When I withdrew, she accused me of being distant. I was losing either way. The children sensed it. They always do. They asked why Mom slept with her phone under her pillow, why she went out so often to clear her head, why she looked irritated when I needed help standing up. I defended her again. I was excellent at that, protecting her image, even as my own eroded. One night, I woke to the sound of her whispering in the hallway. Her voice was soft in a way it hadn't been with me in months. Not angry, not tired. Alive. I didn't hear his name, but I didn't need to. The absence of mine was enough. I confronted her the next morning, gently. Asked if something was wrong, if she felt overwhelmed, if we needed help. Counseling, time, honesty. She looked at me with something like pity. She said I wouldn't understand, that my illness had changed everything, that I was consuming more than I was giving. Those were her words. I remember them exactly because they landed like a verdict. No appeal, no deliberation. That was the moment I realized I was no longer her partner. I was a liability. From then on, the shift accelerated. She stopped including me entirely. Plans were made without notice. Financial conversations were redirected. When I asked about certain accounts, she said the lawyer was handling it. I trusted the process because I trusted the law. I had built my life around that trust. What I didn't see was that the process was already being shaped against me. Looking back, I understand now. The affair didn't begin with a touch. It began with comparison, with the quiet calculation of what I had become versus what I used to be. Weakness is not neutral in a marriage. It demands something, and not everyone is willing to pay. By the time I sensed real danger, the groundwork was finished. I still believed I could reason my way through this. I still believed fairness mattered. That belief would cost me everything. The first official notice arrived in a plain envelope, the kind designed not to attract attention. No return address I recognized, no warning. Just paper thin enough to fold, heavy enough to change a life. I remember holding it in my hands and struggling to open it. My fingers wouldn't cooperate. The irony was almost theatrical. I used my teeth, then sat at the table staring at the words while my coffee went cold beside me. She was filing for divorce. Not just divorce. Everything. Full division of assets. Primary custody. Claims of emotional neglect. Assertions that my condition made me incapable of contributing meaningfully to family life. It was written in language I knew intimately. Careful, neutral, devastating. Language designed not to inflame, only to conclude. And at the bottom of the page was a name I recognized instantly. My lawyer. The man I had trusted to protect what I had built. The man who had eaten at my table. The man who now knew every financial vein worth cutting. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there, numb, in a way no medical condition could explain. This wasn't betrayal as an emotion. This was betrayal as architecture. Planned, reinforced, executed with professional elegance. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. That's what still haunts me. She told me she had to secure her future, that she couldn't risk instability, that love wasn't enough to carry the weight of my illness. She said these things calmly, like a person explaining a budget adjustment. When I asked how long it had been going on, she hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without saying it outright. Long enough. She said the lawyer understood her fear, her exhaustion, her need to feel supported. I almost laughed at that word, supported, as if I hadn't spent years being exactly that while dismantling myself quietly to keep everything else standing. She accused me of using my position to intimidate her. Me, a man who needed help standing up from a chair, a man whose greatest daily victory was getting dressed without assistance. The children were in their rooms while this conversation happened. That detail matters too. I kept my voice even, controlled, judicial. I had spent a lifetime mastering restraint and I wasn't about to abandon it now. But inside, something fundamental cracked. I realized then that she wasn't leaving me. She was replacing me. Replacing my role, my authority, my relevance. The affair wasn't about passion, it was about transition. I was the old structure being dismantled so a new one could rise cleanly without inconvenience. The legal process moved quickly after that. Papers filed, accounts frozen, assets evaluated. I tried to fight, but every move felt like wading through wet cement. My health limited me. My reputation restrained me. Any aggression would be framed as abuse of power. She knew that. They both did. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that the divorce was only the beginning. The real damage hadn't even started, and by the time I realized what they were truly taking from me, there would be nothing left to protect. What followed was not a divorce so much as a controlled demolition. I had always believed that law, at its core, was about balance, about preventing excess, about ensuring no one walked away with more than their share of power or pain. Sitting on the other side of it shattered that illusion completely. The system doesn't protect the vulnerable by default, it protects the prepared, and she was prepared. My accounts were locked before I fully understood what was happening. Investments I had managed carefully for decades were suddenly under review. Properties I assumed were untouchable became leverage. Every safeguard I believed existed had a clause, and every clause had an exception. I recognized the strategy immediately. I had seen it used against others. I had never imagined it would be used against me. My illness became evidence. Medical reports were reframed as proof of incapacity. Notes from doctors, once private, were now exhibits. They painted a picture of a man declining, unreliable, unfit. Not unkindly, not maliciously, just thoroughly. It was terrifying how easily truth could be rearranged to tell a different story. She claimed she had been my caregiver for years, that she had sacrificed opportunities, that she had endured emotional isolation. Some of it was technically accurate. None of it was honest. The nuance was gone, flattened into bullet points designed to extract sympathy and assets. The lawyer, her lawyer, anticipated my every response. He knew my habits, my limits, my reluctance to escalate. He knew I would never publicly accuse him without ironclad proof. He knew I would prioritize my children over my pride. He used all of it. I tried to find new representation, but even that felt compromised. My name carried weight, and weight attracts caution. No one wanted to be seen as attacking a sitting judge, even a weakened one. Every conversation was careful, polite, distant. I felt radioactive. At home, the children watched their lives fragment. Rooms divided, schedules rewritten, conversations interrupted when I entered. I saw confusion settle into their faces like dust. I wanted to explain, to protect them from the ugliness of it all, but I didn't know how to do that without destroying what little stability remained. My wife moved through the house like a stranger who already owned it. She spoke to me through emails copied to attorneys. When we were forced to be in the same room, she avoided my eyes. Not out of guilt, out of efficiency. I was no longer someone she needed to convince. One afternoon during mediation, my hand failed me completely. I dropped a pen while signing a document and couldn't pick it up. The mediator hesitated, then quietly slid it back to me. No one said anything. No one needed to. I felt exposed in a way I never had on the bench. Powerless, observed. That night, alone in what used to be our bedroom, I finally understood the full shape of what was happening. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't anger. This was optimization. She was extracting herself from a life that no longer benefited her, and she was doing it with surgical precision. The affair wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was part of the exit plan. And I was standing in the wreckage, still trying to argue fairness in a process that rewards foresight, not virtue. By the time the settlement was finalized, I would no longer recognize the man who signed it. But I wasn't there yet. Not yet. The settlement was presented as a mercy. That was the word they used. Mercy. As if what remained to me after the division was an act of kindness rather than a calculated allowance. I was advised to accept it quietly, to consider my health, to think about the children, to preserve what little dignity I had left. Dignity, I learned, is often the first thing you're asked to trade. I signed because fighting would have cost more than money. It would have cost time. I didn't know how much of I had left. My condition was progressing faster than the doctors predicted. Some days my legs felt like borrowed tools returned without warning. Some days my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold a fork. The stress accelerated everything. Even my body seemed eager to be done with me. When it was over, the numbers looked unreal. Accounts I had built brick by brick were gone. Properties sold or reassigned. Investments dissolved into obligations I no longer controlled. What remained was enough to survive, not enough to rebuild. A careful cage disguised as security. She moved out quickly, or maybe I did. It's hard to remember who left whom when the house empties itself of warmth. The children split their time according to a schedule that felt less like parenting and more like visitation rights to my own life. Every goodbye hurt more than the last. I learned to smile through it. Children remember tone more than words. People at work avoided me, not out of cruelty, out of discomfort. I was a reminder that authority doesn't protect you from loss, that respect can evaporate when vulnerability enters the room. I took an early leave, then a quiet step back from public life. No announcement, no farewell, just absence. The lawyer didn't hide anymore. He appeared openly at events with her. Introduced himself without shame. He knew I wouldn't confront him. He knew the optics favored him now, a man who had rescued a woman from an ailing husband. I saw how stories get rewritten, how villains are chosen based on convenience, not truth. One afternoon, alone in my reduced apartment, I tried to review old case files out of habit. My hand cramped within minutes. I stared at the pages and felt something close to grief, not for the cases, but for the man who used to handle complexity without fear. That man was gone. What replaced him was quieter, smaller, but still alive. I began writing then, not for anyone else, just to put order somewhere when everything else had become chaos. I wrote about loss, about identity, about how quickly usefulness becomes currency. I didn't write about her. Not yet. That felt too close to reopening a wound I could barely keep closed. Some nights I wondered if she ever thought about what she had done. Not the money, not the strategy, but the timing. The precision with which she left only after I could no longer chase, argue, or recover. I stopped asking myself those questions eventually, because the answers didn't change anything. What changed me was something else entirely, something I didn't yet see coming. And when it arrived, it would force me to confront not just what I had lost, but whether I was willing to remain defined by it. Recovery, I learned, is not a straight line. It's a series of small negotiations with yourself, most of which you lose before you start winning any. After the divorce, silence became my constant companion. Not the peaceful kind people romanticize, but the heavy, pressurized quiet that fills space once occupied by routine and noise. The apartment was too clean, too still. I could hear my own breathing at night, uneven and shallow, as if my body was unsure whether it wanted to keep going. My illness progressed in unpredictable waves. Some mornings I woke up almost functional, tricked into thinking I might regain ground. By afternoon, my legs would betray me again, and I'd sit there staring at the wall, negotiating with myself not to feel angry at something that had no intention and no mercy. Anger, when it came, had nowhere to go. I couldn't be angry at her without exhausting myself. I couldn't be angry at the lawyer without reliving the courtroom in my head, where rules mattered more than morality. I couldn't even be angry at my body for long. Eventually, anger requires energy, and I was running low. The children adjusted faster than I did. That hurt in a strange way. They learned the new schedules, the new normal. They talked about their mother's house with neutral tones, careful not to wound me. I saw how they edited themselves, and I hated that I was now a variable they had to manage. One afternoon after they left, I found myself sitting on the floor because I couldn't stand back up. I stayed there longer than necessary. Not because I was stuck, but because I didn't see the point in rushing anymore. That moment scared me. Not the weakness, the surrender. That was when I realized something important. If I didn't redefine myself, I would disappear quietly. So I started small. Physical therapy on days I wanted to cancel. Writing even when my hands cramped. Calling one old friend I had avoided out of pride. Letting people see me diminished without apologizing for it. Each act felt humiliating at first, then necessary, then neutral. I stopped following my ex-wife's life. No updates, no secondhand stories. I didn't need to see her happiness to validate my loss. I already knew what had happened. Replaying it was a form of self-harm I could finally recognize. There were still nights when the betrayal resurfaced sharply. The realization that she had waited until I was weakest, that she had used my own profession against me, that love had turned conditional without warning. Those thoughts still cut, but they no longer defined the entire day. What surprised me most was this. Once I accepted that I would never get justice in the way I understood it, I felt lighter. Not forgiven, not healed, but untethered. I wasn't a judge anymore. I wasn't a husband. I wasn't the man I had been. I was something unfinished, and somewhere in that unfinished space, the possibility of something new began to flicker. Quietly, cautiously, without asking for permission. The call came late at night, the kind that bypasses thought and goes straight to instinct. There had been an accident, our eldest. The words didn't arrive all at once. They came in fragments broken by static and urgency. Car, intersection, ambulance, intensive care. I remember dropping the phone and needing a moment to understand why the floor felt so far away. My legs refused me again, but this time I didn't curse them. I crawled. I would have crawled across the city if that was what it took. We arrived at the hospital separately and at the same time, drawn there by the same fear. For a moment, the years between us collapsed. The lawyers, the silence, the betrayal, all of it was crushed under the weight of one unbearable possibility. They told us the chances were slim. Machines breathed where my child could not. Tubes, wires, numbers flickering like fragile promises. I stood there useless, unable to offer anything but presence. My ex-wife stood beside me, shaking so hard I thought she might fall. Without thinking, I reached for her. She reached back. We held each other the way we used to, before illness, before resentment, before calculations replaced care. Her head against my shoulder, my arm around her back. For a brief, dangerous moment, something ignited between us. Not desire, not love, but recognition. The memory of who we had been when the world still made sense. I felt it. She felt it. I saw it in her eyes when she looked up at me, searching, desperate, human. In that sterile room, stripped of pretense, we were just parents, terrified of losing a child. Nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the damage, not the future we had dismantled. I almost believed in that suspended space of fear that this was the moment everything realigned. That tragedy had burned away the lies and left something salvageable underneath. Then the doctor returned. Steady voice, careful smile. Good news, miraculous news. Our child was stabilizing, responsive, stronger than expected. Full recovery likely. Relief hit like gravity returning. My knees buckled. I laughed and cried at the same time. We thanked the doctor with voices that didn't sound like our own. I kissed my child's forehead and whispered words I hadn't said aloud in years. And just like that, the spell broke. She stepped back first. The distance returned to her eyes, subtle but unmistakable. The spark that had flared so brightly dimmed under the light of safety. Survival no longer required unity. The moment passed because it no longer served its purpose. I understood then something painful and final. What we shared in that room wasn't reconciliation, it was reflex. Fear can make strangers cling. It can even make former lovers remember why they once mattered to each other. But memory is not intention, and relief does not rebuild what calculation has already dismantled. We left the hospital together, then parted in the parking lot like people who had only briefly intersected. I watched her walk away, knowing that even a miracle wasn't enough to bring her back. Some things, once chosen, stay chosen. And that was the night I finally stopped waiting for her to change her mind. After the hospital, something inside me settled. Not healed, not repaired, just finished. For years, I had been carrying the quiet hope that something external might force a reckoning. An apology. A realization. A moment so undeniable that it would undo the choices already made. Standing beside her in that intensive care unit had been the final test. If anything could have brought us back together, it would have been the possibility of losing our child. And yet, once the danger passed, so did whatever fragile bridge had briefly reappeared between us. That clarity was painful, but it was also clean. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternative outcomes, stopped wondering what I could have done differently. The truth was simple and unflattering. She had already decided who she needed to be, and I no longer fit into that version of her life. My days grew quieter but not emptier. I developed routines shaped around what my body could still manage. Short walks, physical therapy, writing in the mornings when my hands were least uncooperative. I wrote about nothing and everything, memories, observations, fragments of thought. I didn't reread much of it. The act itself was enough. The children noticed the change before I named it. I was calmer, less brittle. When things went wrong, I didn't spiral. When pain flared, I acknowledged it and moved on. I stopped trying to perform strength and started practicing acceptance. It was a subtle shift, but children are experts at detecting authenticity. One afternoon during a follow-up appointment, a nurse sat with me longer than necessary. She spoke gently, not carefully. She didn't ask about my past, she asked about my day. It struck me how rare that had become, to be seen as a person rather than a problem or a history. I didn't think much of it at the time, but over the following weeks, similar moments occurred. Small conversations, shared smiles, a sense that my presence didn't require justification. I hadn't realized how much of my identity had been tied to function until function was gone, and connection remained possible anyway. I wasn't looking for anything that mattered. For the first time since everything collapsed, I wasn't reaching backward or forward. I was standing where I was, imperfect and limited without apology. My ex-wife faded into the background of my thoughts, not erased but repositioned. She became part of my story rather than its central conflict. When we spoke about the children, it was civil, efficient, empty of expectation. That was the final form of our relationship, and I accepted it without resentment. What surprised me most was this. Once I stopped defining myself by what I had lost, I became available to what remained. I didn't know yet what shape that would take. I only knew that the man who had been dismantled was not the man who would disappear. Something else was forming, slowly, quietly, without drama. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. I didn't notice the change all at once. It wasn't dramatic enough for that. It arrived the way morning light does, slowly, without asking permission, illuminating corners I had stopped looking at. There was a woman I began seeing regularly, at first without intention. She worked in a place I had started visiting as part of my adjusted routine. Our conversations were ordinary: weather, books, small frustrations. She never asked what I used to be. She only noticed what I was. That distinction mattered more than I can properly explain. She learned my limitations without making them the subject. When my hand trembled, she didn't rush to help unless I asked. When I needed to sit, she sat too, without comment. There was no pity in her eyes, no calculation, just presence. I realized one day that I felt lighter after talking to her, not because she fixed anything, but because nothing about me needed fixing in that moment. That scared me. Hope is dangerous when you've been dismantled. It feels irresponsible, like tempting fate. I kept my distance emotionally even as I enjoyed the simplicity of her company. I told myself this was temporary, that I was misreading kindness as connection because I had been starved of it for so long. But time has a way of revealing patterns. She remembered things I said in passing, asked about my writing, asked about my children, not out of obligation but curiosity. When I spoke about my past, she listened without interrupting, without reframing it, without trying to rescue me from it. She never asked why my marriage ended. She didn't need the story to place me. I realized then how exhausted I had been from defending my own worth. My ex-wife existed in a different emotional register by then. We coordinated schedules, attended school events with polite distance. The children adapted beautifully, resilient in the way that breaks your heart and heals it at the same time. They noticed I smiled more, that I laughed without forcing it, that I no longer carried bitterness into the room. One evening, after a long conversation with this new woman, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Peace. Not happiness, not excitement. Peace is quieter than that. It doesn't demand. It doesn't rush. It simply exists, steady and unremarkable until you realize how rare it has been. I thought about the man I had been, the judge, the husband, the provider, and how tightly I had held those identities. Losing them had felt like erasure. But sitting there, calm and unafraid of tomorrow, I understood something I wish I had learned sooner. Identity is not a fixed structure, it's a living thing, and mine, against all odds, was still growing. There was only one part of the story left to face. Not the past, but the future, and whether I was finally ready to step into it without armor. That answer would come sooner than I expected. The first time I admitted, out loud, that I was looking forward to something, my voice nearly failed me. It was a small thing. Coffee the next morning. A walk, slow and measured, with someone who matched my pace without announcing it. I caught myself planning ahead, not out of obligation or fear, but quiet anticipation. That was when I knew the long night was ending. I didn't rush anything. I had learned what happens when people confuse urgency with truth. What grew between us did so naturally, without declarations or promises. She knew about my illness, fully and honestly. She knew about my past, in broad strokes. She didn't treat either as a warning label. She once told me something that stayed with me. You don't feel broken. You feel finished with breaking. She was right. I was no longer angry at my ex-wife. Anger had burned itself out, leaving behind understanding without forgiveness. I understood why she left. I understood why she chose security over loyalty, momentum over patience. Understanding didn't excuse it, but it freed me from needing her to be different. We co-parented effectively. The children thrived. They saw two parents who no longer poisoned the air between them. They saw their father calm, present, steady in a way that had nothing to do with authority or strength. They saw a man who had lost much and learned how to remain. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the life I had imagined. The long career, the stable marriage, the graceful aging. I allowed myself to grieve it fully without shame. Grief acknowledged loses its power to ambush. What replaced it wasn't a replica. It was something better suited to who I had become. My illness never disappeared. Some days were still hard. Some days required patience I didn't always have. But I was no longer facing them alone, nor was I defined by them. I had learned the difference between being supported and being managed. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. Loss does not mean failure. Betrayal does not erase your worth. And starting over does not require youth, health, or perfection. It requires honesty. I was a judge once, a husband once, a man certain of how his story would end. I am none of those things now. I am simply someone who survived the collapse of everything he trusted and discovered in the quiet aftermath that what remained was enough to begin again. And this time, I choose peace.